Hello friends, my name is host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People and the teacher of this class called Defensible Typology.
Defensible Typology.
Personality stuff, only not bullshit.
So let's look at an overarching map first of what we're dealing with here. You'll see that Defensible Typology overall has two areas, really, which are theory and practice. However, there's also a third area that's kind of half one, half the other, which is how we would simulate this if we were going to simulate it on a computer. Today we're going over part of the theory section of the class, which includes framings, attentions, fields and perspectives, relational mechanics. We're going to be going over the first one, framings. And there is a companion document which includes all the terms that will be shown in this class today, and you can also access this slideshow independently of the video. Okay, so speaking of terms, let's get into them. There's 19 terms total. I break them into sets here to make them a little bit more manageable. First 5 terms are locutionary, illocutionary, personal, meta framework, and learning framework. Locution is speaking. So locutionary data is made of words that people say out loud and the meanings that the person hopes to convey. This links to affect. Illocutionary data is information the speaker wants to keep private, doesn't intend to convey. And if they do successfully keep it entirely private, then it's inaccessible to the listener. Now, my personal frame is a little different than locutionary, illocutionary, both of which are components of a personal frame. But my overarching personal frame, if I'm saying those terms, I'm saying this is about me, it's about you. In selling this class, I might affirm impacts under one kind of personal frame by presenting my credentials, experience, skills, resume stuff. Or I might explain how my nature as a personality works to make it inevitable that I teach this class well, when presumably. In the latter instance, I've been making a case regarding aspects of self that don't link explicitly to my experience. So it would be personal, but not particular. And particular is another one of the terms that we get to later, okay? Meta framework simply refers to matters outside the scope of cognitive functions explained in this case. In general, outside of the normally topical scope of whatever is being discussed. So when I'm talking about why it matters that cognitive functions be explained at all, then I'm establishing meta framework arguments, because that's not about explaining cognitive functions, that's about explaining why I'm explaining cognitive functions. Learning framework is another synonym for pedagogy, which is like a teaching paradigm. We'll discuss possible approaches that we might take to learning this kind of material, why certain approaches are preferable given the subject of study. This lesson will also be prescriptive when we get to this, advising students regarding how to approach this class, how to maximize positive impacts for you. And we will get back to the map here so you can see where we are in the overall scope of things in a bit. Just to give a better visual representation of what framework is. Framework is like seeing a town from the air. You see it best, but you're not part of it. And the town then in this analogy would be the case, or the case level work, right? So the case level work is the actual explanations of cognitive functions. The framework is explaining your definitions, observations, criteria. Meta framework is what I'm doing now, which is itself a form of framework. It looks outside the town to include impacts that would otherwise be non-topical. So framework, overlooking this whole town here, that doesn't include what that town over there you can see in the distance, but meta framework links those two together. So here's an example of an observation of this picture. 7 buildings are visible. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. True. So observations are like definitions in that they establish ground. We now should both agree there are 7 buildings visible, and we can both work argumentationally off that if we want to. They establish ground and therefore belong in framework. Terms 6 through 10. Framework then is literally making a frame. You can make a frame of 3 kinds of objects: observations, definitions, and criteria. Now note, these aren't physical objects like lighter and cigarette. These are objects like objects on the flow, which we'll get to in a second, okay? Which is to say, they're conceptual, what you might call circuit breakers, okay? The first of these observations establishes axiomatic matters that are so observationally, intuitively correct that they need no warranting, that no warranting is needed or desirable. The second, definitions, constrain the argumentational ground. So we have to say what is included in framing are these things. What's not included in framing are case level arguments with impacts, okay, and warrants and arguments. I mean, well, framings have arguments, but case level warrants, case level impacts are not included in framing. They're explicitly excluded because that's the purpose of defining things, is to allow us to use language to discursively do work. Okay? So, the third element, criteria, or a criterion, explains what qualifies as success or failure. So, if I had a criterion for this class, just a single one, it would be that people walk away from it feeling as though they better understand where they're starting from and overarching view of things than when they started watching it. If I could only pick one criterion, but it's got multiple criteria for success. And you should note that these definitions we're now talking about are part of the framework of the meta framework. By establishing first what terms mean, we can discuss other framework issues purposefully, and the meta framework, a meta framework, is a kind of framework. It's an example of framework, so it's still subject to the same rules as any other framework, which is to say it needs to have a criterion and definitions at the very least, and probably observations, and maybe more than one criterion. If we're talking about arguments, what are we saying? I mean, an argument is a warranted claim of a significant impact. That means you're saying, yeah, important thing because, yeah, and you're saying that you should believe me and change the status quo in some way because of this reason. The flow is usually an imaginary sideways piece of paper on which all the arguments made in a given rhetorical or dialectical exchange are recorded. A warrant is the reason provided to justify your claim. It says, here's why you should agree with my claim. Example, a speaker says, eat oranges for good health. The respondent says, what's the warrant? The speaker says, vitamin C. The respondent can go, okay, now it's an argument. I should eat oranges because they have vitamin C, which leads to good health. It's got a claim, I should eat oranges. It's got a warrant, they have vitamin C. To justify its impact, it'll improve your health. Whether or not you buy that argument is another question, but it's got all the three necessary components to be an argument. Impact. The impact is why a given claim matters. For good health is the impact in the above example. Impacts in abstract models, like what we're doing here, tend to simply be status updates. Uphold, call into question, falsify. But regardless, let's go on to the next slide. That has a lot of terms, right? Here's a nice picture. This will make it easier. This guy right there in that hat, who looks a lot like me, has a personality. That's an observation. Here's another observation. Observation 2. So does that lady right there. She looks so familiar to me. So what's our definition of personality? An individual's personality constitutes parts of the self that remain unchanged throughout that person's lifetime. The salient question, though, is, but what do you mean by parts of people that stay the same? What is that? Well, mostly from a third party, from each of our perspectives about every other person, we mean affect. So you can reliably expect me to approach this through a logical parsing style that treats words as though they have very specific meanings and that they're not so much used to simply convey the momentary state of being that somebody is experiencing, but rather to map and explain things, because that's part of my affect. You can expect me to try to sound somewhat personable while also trying to sound smart or something like that, however you want to interpret it. Those qualities of Eric that remain the same Eric-ishness as they always do, they fall within the range of examples of Eric-iness. Well, that's the stuff you can see, and that's affect. To further understand this parts issue, what do you mean parts that stay the same? Like, I have two arms my whole life. Are they my personality? Well, we need to put it under the frame of psychology itself, which is simply an attempt to answer this question. How do we explain similarities and differences between people? Here's some more terms. This is the last big chunk of terms, and there are shorter definitions. So frame, as we've tried to drive home at this point multiple times, it includes definitions, observations, and criteria. It must include at least one definition and at least one criterion, but it doesn't have to include observations, but it can. And it can include multiple of all of those. What it says here is, actually doing work with language requires that we make explicit the frames under which we're operating. And so right now, this discussion of the metaframes is part of that discursive work. It needs to be done before we really get into the bulk of it, even though it doesn't seem to be especially relevant directly. But you will note that every communicative exchange is framed by both parties. But almost always, in the regular world, both parties don't know their own frame as an explicit argument and won't distinguish between when they're clashing at frame level and when they're clashing at case level. So, in the absence of that knowledge, the capacity to do meaningful work with language is greatly diminished, if not made impossible. I define paradigm here as a perspective or set of arguments that functions as the metaframe for an individual, a performative event, or an intellectual movement. What do I mean by the metaframe for in that case? Well, I mean the thing that is more important than the frame of the thing itself. So, it's like, if I'm supposed to be teaching a literature class, and instead I'm presenting to the students a series of lectures on identity politics, masked as a literature class because I've chosen the most politically charged examples of writings I could find, well then my paradigm has subsumed the frame of my job, right? That's what I mean by a metaframe in that regard, is that it's going to subsume the particularist frame of whatever it is you're doing, or else it doesn't qualify as a paradigm. Psychology is the study of human similarity and difference. Personality, those aspects of an individual that don't change. Parts, whatever you want to say. When I use the word universal, I'm referring to non-personal identities. This means external patterns and observations. It means that rocks is a universal. There are lots of things that can qualify as a rock. That rock is a particular. But in particular, when I'm talking about universals, but more clearly, when I'm talking about universals, I'm usually talking about media objects of some kind, time objects, things that have identity, but not necessarily attributes. Like row, 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 row your boat has more of an identity than it does have attributes, although we could articulate it in terms of attributes. They wouldn't really be attributes of any manifestation of it specifically. Like we couldn't say it's this loud or this quiet. We couldn't say it's played on this instrument or that instrument. We couldn't say it's sung well or sung poorly, because we're talking about the song itself as an identity, not any manifestation of it. So in that regard, objects that are functioning as things that engage universally function as identities, not as particulars. Particular matters are those specific to individuals and their unique experiences. When a judge lets a defendant go on time served, the judge is justifying this by appealing to the particulars. He's been a model prisoner, so the universal rule sentencing guidelines should be set aside for him. Or just, well, you know what? I got bit by an alligator yesterday, so obviously there is a serious epidemic of alligator bitings. They'll be taking the particular and extrapolating it into the universal. So these questions here are what really we are asking when we're saying, what is personality? What leads us to asking about personality at all are these questions. Why is that person so meow compared to most people? Why are those two people so similar to each other even though they're from totally different places? Why does Joe consistently keep acting like Joe even when he should have learned by now that doing that thing that Joe does is desperately a bad idea? Number 4, how can I get Bob to be more meow? Bob needs more meow. That's for sure. Number 5, what the hell is wrong with Betty? What's wrong with Betty? We all want to know what's wrong with Betty. Number 6, how could two brothers raised in the same house by the same parents be so different? These kinds of questions are what underlie all of our study of personality, because what we've noted is that in the history of the world, as we tried to place people into classes, it seems sometimes as though they fit into classes. However, when we try to make those things stick, because, well, look, Jones over here, he's really, really good at figuring out how to solve problems with hinges and stuff like that. So let's make his family the tinkering, solve it with your hands family. But the child born of that family might very well be nothing at all like the father. And this is the problem that, or the mother, for example. And this is the problem that humanity's had for a long time. How do we properly put people into sets when it so clearly appears that people belong in sets, and yet none of the sets we make seem to work? You are here, by the way, probably at the end of this video. I was thinking about splitting this into 2 videos. Probably this is the end of part 1 of this. All the materials will be up. I'm going to start the members thing here. So these videos going forward will be available for members only. I'm going to start my membership thing. Also in that membership area will be an access to a Google Drive folder that has every document I make for this class, every picture I make for this class, plus every other document I think might be interested in anybody. It'll have the old doc dump file in it and whatever else I come across. So that'll be for members. That will update every time I make a new document. It'll update that. So anyway, that'll probably be the end of this video, but I'm going to continue it as one video and then I'll probably cut it in half.
Defensible Typology.